Be glad we let you visit. Those 6 words cost my son and his wife more than they could ever imagine. The strange thing is that Rachel did not even lower her voice when she said it. She stood in the middle of her kitchen holding a tray of cupcakes while guests laughed around her. My grandson Tyler was turning 10 years old that afternoon. Balloons covered the ceiling. Children ran through the backyard. Music drifted through the open patio doors. It should have been one of those happy family days people remember for years. Instead, it became the day I finally understood my place in my own family. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 72 years old. I was married to my husband Frank for 46 years before cancer took him 5 years ago. Since then, I have done my best to stay close to my family. I attended every birthday party, every school concert, every holiday dinner. I never wanted to become one of those grandparents people only remembered when they needed something. That afternoon, I arrived carrying a wrapped baseball glove I had spent nearly $200 on because Tyler had mentioned wanting one during a phone call months earlier. I parked in front of Michael and Rachel's house and noticed the driveway was already full. Friends, neighbors, family members. I smiled as I walked toward the front door. For a moment, I felt grateful. Family still mattered. At least I thought it did. The first sign came when nobody answered the doorbell. I waited. Then I rang again. Eventually, one of Tyler's friends opened the door and ran away without saying anything. I stepped inside and looked around. People filled every room. Yet nobody seemed to notice me. Michael walked past carrying a cooler. He nodded quickly and continued walking. Rachel was arranging food on the kitchen island. "Hi, Rachel," I said. She glanced up. "Oh, you made it." Not hello. Not thank you for coming. Just surprise. As though my attendance had not been expected. I handed her the gift. She placed it on a counter without looking at it. Then she returned to her conversation. I stood there awkwardly for several seconds before moving toward the backyard. The party continued around me. Conversations started and ended without including me. Family photographs were taken without anyone calling me over. Even during cake and presents, I found myself standing near the edge of the patio watching everyone else enjoy the celebration. It felt less like attending a family gathering and more like visiting someone else's event. Later, while helping collect empty paper plates, I overheard Rachel speaking to one of her friends. The woman asked whether I visited often. Rachel laughed softly. Then she said the sentence I will never forget. Honestly, she should be glad we let her visit. The friend looked uncomfortable. I know, because I was standing only a few feet away. Rachel turned and saw me. For a brief second, our eyes met. She knew I had heard every word. Michael was standing nearby. He heard it too. He said nothing. Not one word. The silence hurt far more than the insult. I placed the stack of plates on the counter. I smiled politely. Then I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked why I was leaving early. As I sat inside my car and looked back at the house, I realized something painful. Rachel had only said out loud what they had both been showing me for years. And once I accepted that truth, I began noticing something else. They were treating me like a visitor, but they were already acting like owners. The drive home felt longer than usual that evening. The sun had already begun to disappear behind the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. I kept replaying the moment in my mind. Not the words themselves. Words can be careless. People say things they regret all the time. What stayed with me was what happened afterward. Rachel saw me standing there. She knew I had hurt her. Michael knew too. Neither of them tried to explain. Neither of them followed me outside. Neither of them called later that night. That silence said more than the insult ever could. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light automatically switched on. Frank had installed that light years ago. He always worried about me walking up dark steps. For a moment, I sat in the car and stared at the house. It was not a mansion. Just a comfortable lakefront property we had purchased nearly 30 years earlier. The mortgage had long been paid off. The garden still looked exactly the way Frank liked it. The dock stretched into the water behind the house. Every board, every flower bed, every room held memories. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house greeted me with silence. I had grown used to that since losing Frank. Usually, the quiet felt peaceful. That night it felt different. Heavier somehow. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. For years, that table had been where every important family conversation happened. Christmas plans, vacation ideas, college decisions, family problems. We had solved them all right there. As I looked around the room, a strange realization settled over me. The people sitting around that table today were not the same people who once filled this house with warmth. The signs had been there for years. I just had not wanted to see them. Michael used to call every Sunday. Then it became every other Sunday. Then only when he needed advice. Eventually, sometimes weeks passed without hearing from him at all. Rachel always had an explanation. Life was busy. Work was stressful. The children had activities. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. Looking back, I noticed something else. Whenever conversations involved family memories, Michael seemed distracted. Whenever conversations involved finances, he paid close attention. A few months earlier, he had asked whether I planned to keep the lake house forever. At the time, I thought it was casual conversation. Then there was the holiday dinner the previous year. Rachel had spent nearly 20 minutes discussing property values in the area. She knew exactly how much neighboring homes had sold for. At the time, I assumed she simply found real estate interesting. Now I was not so sure. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The lake outside my kitchen window was perfectly still. I carried my coffee onto the back deck and watched the sunrise. Frank always said calm water reveals things clearly. Standing there, I began noticing details I had ignored for far too long. The way Rachel referred to the house as a future asset. The way Michael occasionally joked about retirement plans involving property he did not own. The way both of them spoke as though time was already moving in only one direction. They never talked about my future. They talked about theirs. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Michael. For a brief moment, I wondered whether he was calling to apologize. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded completely normal. Too normal. We exchanged small talk for several minutes. The weather. Tyler's baseball season. A community event happening downtown. Not once did he mention the party. Not once did he mention Rachel's comment. It was as though the entire thing had never happened. After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time. Then I opened an old photo album Frank had put together years earlier. Inside were photographs spanning decades. Birthdays. Graduations. Family vacations. Smiling faces. Genuine affection. Somewhere along the way, something had changed. And for the first time, instead of asking myself why, I began asking a different question. What exactly did they think they were waiting for? The answer arrived 3 days later when I accidentally saw something I was never supposed to see. Michael had invited me to Tyler's baseball game on a Saturday morning. The field sat on the edge of town beside a small community park. Parents filled the bleachers. Children chased foul balls across the grass. It was the kind of simple American weekend Frank always loved. For most of the game, everything felt normal. Michael sat beside me. We talked about Tyler's pitching. We talked about school. We even laughed a few times. That almost made what happened afterward worse. After the game ended, Michael offered to drive us to a nearby restaurant for lunch. Rachel was meeting us there. We arrived early, and Michael stepped outside to take a phone call while I waited at the table. His phone remained beside his seat. I was not trying to snoop. I had never been that kind of person. Then the screen lit up. A message preview appeared before I could look away. The sender was Rachel. The message read, "Do not forget to ask her about the trust. We need to know what happens with the lake house." My eyes froze on the words. Seconds later, another message appeared. "If she keeps putting it off, we will never be able to plan anything." I looked away immediately. My stomach tightened. Not because they were discussing money. Families discuss money all the time. What unsettled me was the assumption buried inside those words. The lake house was not something they owned. It was not something they had earned. Yet they were already building plans around it. When Michael returned, I acted as though nothing had happened. Rachel arrived a few minutes later. Throughout lunch, I listened more carefully than ever before. Once you know what to listen for, certain things become impossible to miss. Rachel asked whether I still planned to maintain the property by myself. Michael asked whether I had updated my estate paperwork recently. Rachel mentioned rising property taxes around the lake. Then she casually remarked that waterfront homes were selling for record prices. None of the comments sounded suspicious by themselves. Together, however, they formed a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. Later that evening, I sat in my living room reviewing old family records. Frank had always been organized. Every important document had a place. As I sorted through papers, I discovered something that made me pause. Several years earlier, when Frank updated our estate plan, he had attached handwritten notes explaining his decisions. One sentence stood out. Assets should never become expectations. I read it twice, then a third time. The words felt strangely relevant. Frank understood something I was only beginning to recognize. Gratitude disappears when people start viewing gifts as guarantees. Over the following week, I noticed even more signs. Michael called twice asking whether I had considered downsizing. Rachel sent an article about retirement communities near the lake. Neither conversation felt accidental. They were probing, measuring, waiting. The more I observed, the more I realized they were no longer viewing me as the owner of my future. In their minds, I had somehow become the caretaker of theirs. One evening, while watching the sunset from the dock, I found myself thinking about the difference between inheritance and entitlement. Frank and I spent decades building this life. Early mornings, long workdays, sacrifices, careful decisions. Nothing had been handed to us. Yet somewhere along the way, Michael and Rachel seemed to have stopped seeing the story behind what we owned. They only saw the ending. And for the first time, I began to wonder what would happen if that ending changed completely. A week later, I heard the conversation that removed any remaining doubt. It happened entirely by accident. Michael had asked if I could watch Tyler for a few hours after school while he attended a work meeting. I agreed immediately. Spending time with my grandson was one of the few things that still felt uncomplicated. That afternoon, Tyler and I sat at the kitchen table working on a science project. Around 5 o'clock, Michael arrived to pick him up. Rachel came with him. After a few minutes of conversation, Tyler remembered he had left part of his project materials upstairs and ran to get them. Michael followed him. Rachel remained in the kitchen with me. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and stepped onto the back patio to answer. The sliding door remained slightly open. I was not trying to listen. In fact, I was washing dishes at the sink. Then I heard my own address. My hands stopped moving. Rachel laughed softly. "Of course it will sell fast," she said. A pause followed. "The location alone makes it valuable." Another pause. "Michael thinks we should wait a little longer, but eventually it will be ours anyway." I stared through the kitchen window at the lake beyond the backyard. Rachel continued speaking. "The property taxes are high, but once the house is sold, it solves a lot of problems." A few moments later, she ended the call and walked back inside. Her expression never changed. She smiled. She asked whether Tyler had finished his project. She acted as though nothing unusual had happened. So did I. But something inside me had shifted. Later that evening, after everyone left, I walked through the house room by room. The living room where Frank and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. The guest room where Michael slept during college breaks. The screened porch where we spent countless summer evenings watching storms move across the lake. Every corner carried memories. Yet Rachel had spoken about selling it with the same emotional attachment someone might have for an old appliance. I eventually found myself standing in Frank's workshop behind the garage. The room remained almost exactly as he left it. Tools hung neatly on the wall. Shelves held fishing gear, paint cans, and decades of carefully organized supplies. On one shelf sat a small wooden box I had not opened in years. Inside were handwritten notes Frank occasionally left for himself. Garden measurements, repair reminders, vacation ideas. One folded piece of paper caught my attention. I unfolded it carefully. The note was short. It simply listed goals he hoped our family would always remember. Work hard. Stay grateful. Earn your own future. I smiled sadly. Frank believed those values would pass naturally from one generation to the next. Looking back, I was no longer certain. The following weekend, Michael invited me to dinner. Throughout the meal, Rachel repeatedly brought up real estate. A family moving to Florida. A home that recently sold above asking price. A neighbor who downsized after retirement. The topic surfaced so often it almost felt rehearsed. At one point, Michael casually asked whether I had ever considered moving closer to town. I looked at him carefully. Why would I do that? He shrugged. Just thinking ahead. There were those words again. Thinking ahead. Everyone seemed very interested in planning my future. Nobody seemed interested in asking what I wanted that future to be. Driving home that night, I realized the conversation was no longer about a house. The house simply represented something larger. Independence. Choice. Control. Frank and I had spent decades building a life. Michael and Rachel were already discussing what came after it. And for the first time, I began wondering whether they would still be so interested if the future they imagined suddenly disappeared. The next morning, I found myself thinking about Frank more than usual. Not because I missed him any more than I normally did. That part never changed. I missed him every day. What occupied my mind was the note I had found in his workshop. Earn your own future. The words stayed with me as I walked along the shoreline behind the house. The lake was calm. A light breeze moved across the water. For decades, this place had represented stability. Frank and I built our lives here. We celebrated promotions here. We welcomed grandchildren here. We sat on this very shoreline and planned our retirement together. Yet lately, it seemed other people were planning a future for this property that did not include my opinion. 3 days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. My neighbor Susan stopped by with a basket of muffins she had baked that morning. We sat on the back deck drinking coffee while watching boats move slowly across the lake. At one point, she hesitated before speaking. "I hope you do not mind me asking," she said. "Are you really planning to sell the house?" I looked at her in surprise. "Why would you think that?" Susan frowned. "Rachel mentioned it a few weeks ago. She said you were considering moving and simplifying things." I remained silent. Susan immediately realized something was wrong. "Oh dear," she said quietly. Maybe I misunderstood. But I knew she had not misunderstood. Someone had planted the idea. Someone had already begun speaking about decisions I had never made. After Susan left, I sat alone for nearly an hour. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Discussions about the house. Discussions about future plans. Discussions about life after I was no longer living there. What troubled me most was not the money. It was the assumption. Somewhere along the way, Michael and Rachel had stopped seeing this property as my home. They saw it as their opportunity. That weekend, I decided to organize some old files stored in the study. Frank always kept detailed records. Tax documents, investment reports, insurance papers. While sorting through a cabinet drawer, I discovered a folder I had not opened in years. Inside were letters, notes, and planning documents connected to our estate. Near the back of the folder was a handwritten page from Frank. It was not a legal document, just personal thoughts. One sentence immediately caught my attention. Never confuse love with expectation. I sat quietly staring at those words. Frank understood people better than I ever did. He knew that generosity loses its meaning when it becomes assumed. As the afternoon sunlight filled the room, I began looking at everything differently. For years, I had worried about leaving enough behind. Enough security. Enough comfort. Enough opportunity. Suddenly, a different question emerged. What exactly was I rewarding? A few days later, Michael called. His tone was cheerful. He mentioned a local real estate article he had recently read. Waterfront property values were climbing rapidly. Then he casually asked whether I had considered getting a market evaluation on the house. I smiled even though he could not see me. "Why would I do that?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Just curiosity," he replied. Curiosity. The same word people use when they do not want to reveal their real interest. After we ended the call, I looked around the study. Family photographs lined the shelves. Frank's old reading glasses still rested on his desk. The house felt exactly the same as it always had. Yet something inside me had changed. For the first time, I stopped thinking about what Michael and Rachel expected to receive someday. Instead, I began wondering what Frank and I actually wanted our legacy to mean. And once that question entered my mind, another idea followed close behind. An idea that neither Michael nor Rachel would ever see coming. The following Monday, I made a phone call that changed the direction of everything. I did not call Michael. I did not call Rachel. I did not call a friend looking for advice. I called the attorney who had helped Frank and me update our estate plans years earlier. His office was located downtown, less than 30 minutes from the lake house. When his receptionist offered an appointment later that week, I accepted immediately. The morning of the meeting, I drove into town beneath clear blue skies. The entire trip felt strangely peaceful. Not because I knew exactly what I intended to do. I did not. What I knew was that I needed clarity. For too long, I had been reacting to other people's assumptions. It was time to focus on my own decisions. The attorney greeted me warmly. He remembered Frank well. After a few minutes of conversation, he asked what had brought me in. I took a deep breath and told him everything. The comments. The questions. The discussions about the house. The growing sense that my future had become a planning project for other people. He listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked a simple question. What do you want your legacy to accomplish? The question caught me off guard. I expected legal discussions, documents, technical details. Instead, he asked about purpose. For a moment, I thought about Frank. I thought about the years we spent building a life together. The sacrifices, the hard work, the values we tried to pass on. Then I answered honestly. I want it to mean something. The attorney nodded. He explained that assets are tools. Houses, investments, savings. They can support people. They can create opportunities. They can strengthen communities. The important thing is deciding what outcome matters most. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed possibilities. Some were traditional. Some were not. By the time I left, my mind felt clearer than it had in months. Driving home, I realized something important. Michael and Rachel believed the future was already written. They believed all that remained was waiting. What they failed to understand was that the future belongs to the person making decisions in the present. Over the next several weeks, I became unusually busy. Meetings, paperwork, research, phone calls. Nothing dramatic. Nothing secretive. Just thoughtful planning. When Michael called, I remained pleasant. When Rachel asked questions about the property, I smiled and changed the subject. Neither of them noticed anything different. They assumed my quietness meant acceptance. In reality, it meant certainty. One afternoon, Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. She brought coffee and pastries from a local bakery. During the visit, she once again mentioned how much work a large property could be for someone my age. Then she spoke about simplifying life, reducing responsibilities, creating flexibility. I listened politely. Eventually, she looked around the living room and smiled. It really is a beautiful place, she said. Someone is going to be very lucky someday. I returned her smile. Yes, I said. I believe they will. The answer seemed to satisfy her. It satisfied me for a different reason. By then, I had already begun seeing the situation differently. The lake house was no longer just property. It had become a test. Not of money. Not of inheritance. Of character. Who valued the memories attached to it? Who valued the effort behind it? Who valued the people who built it? As summer slowly moved toward autumn, I continued putting plans into motion. Quietly. Carefully. Patiently. Every document brought me one step closer to a decision that would surprise everyone. And the most surprising part of all was how calm I felt. For the first time since hearing Rachel's words at Tyler's birthday party, I was no longer focused on what had been taken from me. I was focused on what I still had the power to choose. By early October, Michael and Rachel seemed happier than they had been in months. At first, I could not understand why. Nothing significant had changed, at least not from their perspective. Then little comments began slipping into conversations. Small assumptions. Casual observations. Hints about plans that had not yet happened. One Sunday afternoon, I joined them for lunch after Tyler's baseball practice. The restaurant overlooked a small marina near the lake. We sat outside beneath bright blue skies while boats drifted across the water. The conversation remained ordinary until Rachel pointed toward a newly renovated waterfront home. "That is exactly the kind of place I would buy if we ever moved closer to the lake," she said. Michael smiled. "You have already planned the furniture." Rachel laughed. "Only because I like being prepared." Then she glanced at me. "Some opportunities do not come around twice." The comment lasted only a few seconds. Yet something about it felt directed. I simply smiled and continued eating. Over the following weeks, similar moments appeared everywhere. Rachel talked about future renovations she would love to make to a waterfront property. Michael mentioned investment ideas that required additional capital. They never directly referenced my house. They no longer needed to. The assumptions had become part of their normal thinking. One evening, I attended a school concert for Tyler. Before the performance began, parents gathered in the auditorium lobby. While speaking with another mother, I overheard Rachel discussing long-term plans. She spoke confidently about where the family hoped to be in 5 years. Larger home. More financial flexibility. Better opportunities. Listening from a distance, I noticed how often those plans seemed connected to resources they did not yet possess. Resources they appeared convinced would eventually arrive. That same week, I met with my attorney once again. By then, months of careful preparation had already taken place. Documents had been reviewed. Options had been explored. Every decision had been made thoughtfully and legally. As we sat across from each other in his office, he asked whether I still felt comfortable moving forward. I did not hesitate. "Yes," I said. For the first time, the answer came easily. Not because I was angry. The anger had faded long ago. What remained was clarity. The attorney nodded and slid several folders across the desk. Everything was ready. The next steps would happen soon. Driving home afterward, I felt surprisingly light. The burden I had carried since Tyler's birthday party no longer weighed on me. I finally understood something important. Respect cannot be inherited. Gratitude cannot be inherited. Character cannot be inherited. Those things must be earned. A few days later, Rachel stopped by unexpectedly carrying coffee and pumpkin bread. We sat in the kitchen overlooking the lake while autumn leaves drifted across the yard. She seemed unusually cheerful. At one point, she looked out the window and smiled. "This property really is something special." I nodded. "It is." She continued staring at the shoreline. "Frank would be happy knowing it stays in the family." For a brief moment, silence filled the room. I studied her expression carefully. She sounded sincere. That was what made this situation so strange. Rachel no longer viewed her expectations as expectations. In her mind, they had already become facts. "Frank cared about values more than property," I said quietly. Rachel smiled politely. "Of course." Yet I was not sure she understood. After she left, I walked down to the dock and watched the sun sink lower across the water. The lake reflected shades of gold and orange. Everything felt peaceful. Behind that peace, however, an important reality remained hidden. Michael and Rachel believed they were getting closer to the future they had imagined. They believed time was working in their favor. What neither of them realized was that the future they were celebrating no longer existed. And very soon, they were going to discover that for themselves. The final documents were signed on a quiet Thursday morning in late October. The day itself felt surprisingly ordinary. The sky was clear. The air was cool. Leaves covered the sidewalks in shades of gold and red. If someone had passed me on the street, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just a 72-year-old woman going about her day. They would never have guessed that one of the most important decisions of my life had just been completed. After months of planning, meetings, and reflection, the lake house was officially sold. The process had been handled carefully and professionally. Every document was reviewed. Every legal requirement was satisfied. Every decision had been made with purpose. As I left the attorney's office, I felt neither excitement nor regret. I felt peace. For months, I had carried the weight of disappointment. The comments, the assumptions, the growing realization that people I loved had begun valuing my possessions more than my presence. That burden disappeared the moment the final signatures were complete. The sale itself attracted considerable interest. Waterfront properties in the area remained highly desirable. The buyers were a retired couple relocating from another state. During our conversations, they spoke about fishing on the dock, hosting grandchildren during the summer, and restoring several parts of the property while preserving its character. Listening to them reminded me of Frank and me all those years ago. They saw a home. They saw memories waiting to be created. That mattered to me. Over the next several days, I completed the remaining arrangements. Some of the proceeds were directed towards several charitable projects Frank had always admired. One supported educational scholarships for local students. Another helped maintain community recreation programs near the lake. Additional funds were structured to support causes that reflected the values Frank and I shared throughout our marriage. None of these decisions were impulsive. Each one represented careful thought. Each one answered the question my attorney had asked months earlier. What do you want your legacy to accomplish? For the first time, I felt confident in the answer. Meanwhile, Michael and Rachel remained completely unaware. In fact, they seemed more optimistic than ever. A week after the closing, Michael invited me to dinner. Rachel spent much of the evening discussing holiday plans. Tyler talked excitedly about baseball. The conversation felt pleasant on the surface. Yet, several moments caught my attention. Rachel mentioned how beautiful the lake would look during the winter. Michael talked about future family gatherings. Neither realized those plans rested on assumptions that no longer existed. I listened quietly. Not because I was hiding something. Because there was no reason to rush the truth. Eventually, reality arrives on its own. After dinner, Michael walked me to my car. As we stood in the driveway, he smiled and asked whether I had any plans for the weekend. A few things, I replied. He nodded. Good. It is important to keep planning ahead. I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I wished him a good night and drove home. Except home was no longer the lake house. Temporary arrangements had already been made while I prepared for the next chapter of my life. As I settled into my new surroundings that evening, I looked through the window at the city lights in the distance and felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Freedom. Not because I had escaped anyone. Not because I had won a battle. Because I had reclaimed ownership of my future. The most remarkable part was that Michael and Rachel still believed they were moving steadily toward the future they expected. They had no idea that the future they imagined had quietly disappeared weeks earlier. And very soon, they were going to learn exactly where it had gone. The truth came out the week before Thanksgiving. I did not arrange a dramatic meeting. I did not call anyone together. Life handled that part on its own. Michael called one evening sounding confused. A neighbor had mentioned seeing new owners at the lake house. At first, he assumed there had been some misunderstanding. Then he asked me directly, "Mom, what did they mean when they said the property was sold?" The silence that followed felt strangely calm. "They meant exactly what they said," I replied. For several seconds, he did not speak. Then came a nervous laugh. "Sold? What do you mean sold?" I looked out the window of my apartment at the city lights below. "I sold the house, Michael." Another silence. Longer this time. "You sold it?" he finally asked. "Yes." Within an hour, Michael and Rachel were sitting in my living room. Neither looked angry. They looked stunned. Rachel was the first to speak. "Why would you do that?" I studied her face carefully. It was the same face I had watched for months. The same person who spoke about my future as though it belonged to her. Yet now she seemed genuinely shocked that I had made a decision without consulting her. "Because it was my house," I said quietly. Michael leaned forward. "You never told us. You never asked what I wanted." The room fell silent again. Rachel looked down. Michael stared at the floor. For the first time, neither of them seemed to have a prepared answer. Eventually Rachel spoke. "We thought it would stay in the family." I nodded slowly. "Interesting." She frowned. "What does that mean?" I took a deep breath. "It means I spent months listening to both of you talk about the house. The property value. the future plans, the renovations you wanted to make someday. Yet neither of you asked whether I was happy there. Neither of you asked what I wanted my future to look like. Michael rubbed his forehead. Mom, that was never our intention. Perhaps not, I said. But intentions matter less than actions. Nobody argued with that. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. For the first time, I explained everything. The birthday party, the comments, the assumptions. The way I slowly realized I was being treated like a temporary obstacle standing between other people and their plans. Rachel's eyes filled with embarrassment. Michael looked heartbroken. What surprised me most was that neither tried to deny it. Deep down, they knew. Finally, Michael asked the question that had been hanging over the entire conversation. What happened to the money? I smiled softly. It went exactly where I wanted it to go. I told them about the scholarships, the community programs, the charitable projects Frank would have admired. I explained that part of our legacy would now help people create futures of their own. Rachel looked away. Michael sat quietly. Neither seemed to know what to say. As they prepared to leave, Michael stopped at the door. I am sorry, he said. This time, the apology felt different. Not defensive. Not convenient. Honest. I believed him. Rachel hesitated before speaking. I am sorry too. I nodded. I know. After they left, I stood alone by the window for several minutes. The city below glowed beneath the evening sky. I thought about Frank. I thought about the lake house. I thought about everything that had happened since that birthday party. In the end, the greatest loss was never the property. It was the respect that disappeared long before anyone noticed. Fortunately, respect can be rebuilt. Trust can be rebuilt. Families can heal when people choose honesty over entitlement. As for me, I finally understood something Frank tried to teach our family years ago. A legacy is not what you leave behind. A legacy is what your choices reveal about who you are. And the moment they made me feel like a guest in my own family, I stopped worrying about who would inherit my property and started focusing on what I wanted my life to stand for.